The news broke without warning, flashing across phones and television screens with a sense of urgency that instantly captured attention. Just minutes earlier, investigators had reportedly confirmed the existence of a second underground tunnel beneath Rob Reiner's estate, a discovery that immediately deepened the mystery already surrounding the property. The words second tunnel alone were enough to provoke unease. But what unsettled people most was the suggestion that this passage had remained hidden for decades, unnoticed even by those closest to the estate. As images of the hillside property began circulating again, viewers were left wondering how something so substantial could exist beneath a home so publicly known, and what purpose it could possibly have served. According to early accounts, the discovery occurred during a follow-up structural survey ordered after unusual readings were detected beneath a section of the grounds previously believed to be solid bedrock. Engineers conducting routine scans noticed a hollow void that did not align with known blueprints. At first, the anomaly was dismissed as a natural cavity or an old utility channel. But as the instruments were recalibrated and the scans repeated, the outline became unmistakable. This was not a random formation. It was linear, reinforced, and deliberately constructed. The confirmation of a second tunnel immediately raised questions about the first. That initial passage, revealed earlier, had already sparked intense speculation about its origin and use. Some believed it dated back to earlier ownership of the land, possibly connected to Cold War-era construction or forgotten private infrastructure common in certain coastal estates. Others suggested it may have been part of a long-abandoned security system, designed during a time when privacy and protection were paramount for high-profile residents. Yet the emergence of a second tunnel complicated every theory. Two tunnels implied planning, intent, and a scope far greater than previously assumed. What intensified the intrigue was the reported location of this newly discovered passage. Unlike the first tunnel, which appeared to run along the perimeter of the property, the second was said to extend inward, branching from a concealed access point beneath a section of the main structure. Investigators described the entrance as expertly hidden, masked behind architectural features that blended seamlessly with the foundation. To casual observation, there was nothing unusual. Only detailed structural analysis revealed the truth. A S-word spread. Speculation exploded. Commentators debated whether Rob Reiner himself had known about the tunnel. Those familiar with the estate's history noted that the property had changed hands multiple times before Reiner acquired it. Each renovation added layers of complexity, potentially obscuring older construction. Some argued that it was entirely possible for such a structure to exist without the current owner's knowledge, especially if it had been sealed and integrated into later designs. Others were not convinced. They pointed to the sophistication of the construction, noting that the tunnel was reportedly reinforced with materials consistent with mid to late 20th century engineering standards. This suggested it was not a relic from the distant past, but something built with relatively modern techniques. That detail alone fueled theories that the tunnel may have been commissioned intentionally, its purpose deliberately concealed. Investigators remained cautious in their statements. They emphasized that no conclusions had been drawn about why the tunnel existed or who authorized its construction. At this stage, the focus was on documentation, mapping, and safety. The tunnel's interior had not yet been fully explored, and officials stressed that premature assumptions could distort the facts. Still, the phrase, "what's inside changes everything," began circulating widely, hinting at discoveries yet to be revealed. Neighbors and local historians were drawn into the conversation. Some recalled rumors dating back years, whispers of unusual subterranean work during renovations that never quite made sense at the time. Others dismissed those stories as exaggerations, the kind of myths that often surround prominent properties. Yet with each new detail released, skepticism gave way to curiosity. The idea of hidden spaces beneath a familiar home tapped into a deeper psychological tension. Tunnels represent secrecy, escape, and concealment. They suggest stories beneath the surface, unseen layers that challenge the image presented above ground. In this case, The contrast between Rob Reiner's well-known public life and the private mystery beneath his estate made the discovery even more compelling. AS investigators prepared for a controlled entry into the tunnel. The public waited. Social media filled with speculation, diagrams, and amateur analyses. Some predicted the tunnel would lead to nothing more than an empty corridor, its mystery deflated by reality. Others believed it could contain forgotten storage, old equipment, or documents left behind by previous occupants. A few went further, imagining connections to historical events or private dealings long buried by time. What remained undeniable was the shift in perception. The estate was no longer just a residence associated with a celebrated figure. It had become a site of unanswered questions. Each new development added weight to the sense that something significant lay beneath the surface, waiting to be understood. Whether the tunnel would ultimately prove mundane or extraordinary, its existence alone had already altered the narrative. AS officials worked behind closed doors. The world watched, suspended between imagination and fact. The discovery of a second tunnel did not provide answers. It multiplied questions, and in doing so, it ensured that attention would not fade quickly. Whatever lay inside, the moment marked a turning point, one that transformed curiosity into anticipation and made it clear that the story was far from over. As the investigation moved forward, the tone shifted from shock to methodical scrutiny. Specialists were brought in to determine not just where the tunnel ran, but how it had been built and what conditions existed inside. Ground-penetrating radar traced the passage several meters beyond the initial access point, revealing turns, reinforced walls, and what appeared to be a widened chamber further down. This was not a crude shaft or an improvised crawl space. It was engineered, deliberate, and designed to last. Reports indicated that the tunnel walls were lined with concrete and steel supports, materials chosen to resist moisture and pressure. Ventilation shafts, narrow but functional, suggested the builders anticipated long-term use rather than temporary concealment. Electrical conduits were also detected, though no active power source had yet been confirmed. The presence of wiring raised immediate questions about lighting, surveillance, or equipment once housed below ground. Authorities proceeded cautiously. Structural integrity assessments came first, followed by air quality tests to ensure safe entry. The last thing investigators wanted was to trigger a collapse or encounter hazardous conditions. These precautions slowed the process, but they also underscored how serious the discovery was being treated. This was no longer a curiosity. It was a site requiring professional oversight. AS details emerged. Attention turned to property records and renovation permits. Decades of documentation were reviewed, searching for any mention of subterranean construction. What investigators found instead were gaps, periods where extensive renovations were approved, but descriptions remained vague. Structural modifications were listed, yet no explicit reference to underground expansion appeared. Whether this omission was accidental or intentional remained unclear. Former contractors were contacted, some now retired, others long removed from the area. A few recalled working on complex foundation projects, but none claimed direct involvement with tunnel construction. Memory, after all, fades, and large projects often involve compartmentalized teams. It was entirely possible that no single individual understood the full scope of what had been built. The estate's layout complicated matters further. Built into a hillside, the property naturally lent itself to layered construction. Basements, retaining walls, and terraces created a maze of structural elements that could conceal access points without raising suspicion. Investigators theorized that the tunnel entrance may have been integrated during one such phase, hidden in plain sight as part of a larger redesign. Public reaction intensified as rumors filled the information vacuum. Some speculated about security concerns, suggesting the tunnel was designed as an escape route or safe passage during emergencies. High-profile individuals often invest in extreme privacy measures, especially during periods of heightened threat. Others proposed that the tunnel served a logistical purpose, allowing discreet movement of staff or supplies without attracting attention. More sensational theories also circulated, fueled by imagination rather than evidence. Online forums buzzed with claims of secret rooms, hidden archives, or clandestine meetings. Investigators were quick to caution against these narratives, emphasizing that speculation could overshadow facts. Still, the lack of immediate answers allowed such ideas to flourish. What added another layer of intrigue was the reported discovery of markings inside the tunnel. Preliminary observations described symbols and measurements etched into the concrete, possibly indicating construction phases or reference points. Engineers recognized these as common practices among builders, not cryptic messages. Yet to the public, they became symbols of mystery, photographed and shared widely. The widened chamber detected by scans became the focal point of anticipation. Its dimensions suggested it was intended as more than a passageway. Investigators theorized it could have functioned as a storage area, a maintenance hub, or even a small room designed for extended occupancy. Until physical entry was made, these remained educated guesses. As days passed, patience wore thin. People wanted answers, clarity, closure. Officials resisted the pressure, insisting that careful documentation mattered more than speed. They knew that once information was released, it would shape public understanding permanently. Accuracy, therefore, was essential. Behind the scenes, discussions took place about jurisdiction and responsibility. Was this purely a private property matter, or did the tunnel's existence raise broader concerns? If the construction violated codes or concealed hazards, regulatory agencies might need to intervene. These considerations added complexity to an already delicate situation. The estate itself became a symbol of duality. Above ground, it represented a familiar image associated with a public figure and a known history. Below ground, it embodied uncertainty, the unknown layers beneath carefully curated surfaces. That contrast captured attention in a way few stories could. As preparations for entry continued, one thing became clear. Regardless of what was ultimately found, the discovery had already altered perceptions. It reminded everyone that places, like people, can contain hidden depths. Some are harmless, others consequential, but all challenge assumptions. The second tunnel did not simply add to an existing mystery. It reframed it. Instead of asking why a single passage existed, investigators now asked what system it belonged to. What network, what intention, what history lay beneath the soil? Those questions, unanswered for now, ensured that the story would continue to unfold. When investigators finally received clearance to enter the tunnel, the atmosphere shifted again from distant speculation to direct confrontation with the unknown. The first steps were taken slowly, lights cutting through air that had not moved in years. Dust rose with each footfall, confirming that whatever the space had been, it had not been accessed recently. The silence inside was heavy, broken only by the faint echo of movement along the reinforced walls. Initial observations confirmed what scans had suggested. The tunnel was tall enough for an adult to walk upright, with a slight downward slope that leveled out after several meters. The floor showed signs of intentional grading, not erosion. This detail alone ruled out natural formation entirely. Someone had planned this path, measured it, and committed resources to make it permanent. As the team advanced, they documented everything. Wall textures, joint seams, bolt placements, and tool marks were photographed and logged. These details would later help estimate the era of construction and the techniques used. Early impressions suggested professionalism rather than improvisation. This was not a hurried project done in secrecy by untrained hands. It bore the signature of experienced builders. About halfway in, investigators encountered the first branching point. A narrower corridor veered off to the left, its entrance partially obscured by debris that appeared to have been deliberately placed. Unlike the main tunnel, this offshoot felt intentionally closed, as if access had been discouraged rather than forgotten. The decision was made to focus first on the main route, leaving the branch for later examination. As they continued, the air grew cooler. Ventilation shafts detected earlier were now visible, small grates embedded high along the walls. Though inactive, their placement suggested airflow had once been carefully managed. This reinforced the idea that the tunnel was meant to be occupied, at least for short periods. It was not simply a conduit, but a controlled environment. The widened chamber eventually came into view, and with it, the sense that the tunnel's purpose might finally become clearer. The space opened abruptly, forming a rectangular room with reinforced corners and a higher ceiling. The walls here were smoother, less utilitarian. Faint outlines on the concrete suggested that fixtures or shelving had once been installed, later removed or dismantled, but on the floor, investigators found traces of old wiring and mounting brackets. Whatever equipment had been housed here was no longer present, but its absence spoke volumes. Removal had been thorough, not the result of decay. This suggested an intentional clearing, possibly before the tunnel was sealed or abandoned. One of the most striking features was a secondary exit from the chamber, sealed behind a steel panel welded into place. Its surface showed signs of age, but no rust perforation, indicating it had been closed deliberately and maintained long enough to prevent deterioration. The question immediately arose: where did this exit lead, and why was it sealed? Speculation intensified even among professionals. Some believed the chamber may have served as a secure storage space, possibly for sensitive materials. Others proposed it functioned as a coordination point, a place where people could gather unseen. The lack of furnishings made definitive conclusions difficult, but the design pointed toward intentional use rather than accident. Investigators also noted the absence of personal items. No discarded tools, no remnants of clothing, no evidence of long-term habitation. This absence suggested discipline. Spaces used casually often accumulate traces of human presence. This one had been left deliberately clean. AS findings were relayed upward. Officials prepared carefully worded briefings. They knew that every detail released would be scrutinized, amplified, and interpreted far beyond its original context. The phrase, "what's inside changes everything," gained traction not because of any single discovery, but because of what the tunnel represented collectively. It was proof of planning that had never been disclosed. Public discourse shifted again. Attention moved away from whether the tunnel existed to why it had been built and then erased. Commentators questioned who benefited from such secrecy and under what circumstances it would have been deemed necessary. Each theory reflected broader anxieties about hidden power and unseen systems. Investigators, however, remained focused on evidence. Soil samples were collected to determine when the chamber had last been disturbed. Residue tests were conducted to identify whether chemicals, fuels, or other materials had been stored there. Results would take time, and patience became the most valuable resource. As the team exited the tunnel, sealing it temporarily for further analysis, one conclusion was unavoidable. This was not an isolated structure. It was part of a larger design, one that had been carefully concealed and later intentionally neutralized. The tunnel told a story not through what it contained, but through what it no longer did. Above ground, the estate remained unchanged, serene, almost indifferent to the activity beneath it. That contrast unsettled those involved. It was a reminder that surfaces can be deceiving, and that history does not always announce itself openly, but by the end of the day. Investigators knew more than they had before, yet far less than they wanted. The tunnel had answered one question while raising dozens more. And in doing so, it confirmed what many had begun to suspect. Whatever had been hidden beneath the estate was not accidental, and understanding it would require time, restraint, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. AS analysis expanded beyond the physical structure. Investigators began reconstructing a timeline, not of events, but of decisions. The question was no longer simply what the tunnel was, but when it entered the logic of the property. Architectural historians were consulted to interpret materials, reinforcement styles, and construction signatures. Their preliminary consensus suggested a build period consistent with extensive renovations carried out decades earlier. a time when subterranean additions were sometimes pursued quietly for privacy and security rather than secrecy in the sinister sense. This distinction mattered. Officials were careful to separate imagination from inference. A tunnel could exist for many reasons, some mundane, some strategic, none inherently unlawful. The danger lay in allowing mystery to substitute for evidence. Investigators therefore framed their work around verification rather than narrative. Every claim required grounding in documentation. Every theory cross-checked against physical fact. Attention turned to the estate's relationship with the surrounding land. Surveyors discovered that the tunnel's trajectory aligned with natural contours of the hillside, minimizing excavation resistance and structural risk. This indicated foresight. Builders had worked with the terrain, not against it. Such planning reduced cost and visibility, reinforcing the idea that concealment was a functional byproduct rather than the sole objective. The sealed exit panel became a focal point of renewed scrutiny. Metallurgists examined weld patterns and corrosion levels to estimate when it had been closed. Early findings suggested the sealing occurred years after initial construction. This implied a change in use, a moment when whatever purpose the tunnel once served was intentionally concluded. Closure, not abandonment, became the operative concept. Investigators considered scenarios that required such finality. Security protocols change. Properties evolve. What is necessary in one era becomes obsolete in another. The panel may have marked the end of a precaution no longer needed. In that light, the tunnel was less a secret than a retired safeguard. Parallel to physical analysis, legal teams reviewed zoning laws and building codes from the relevant periods. Regulations governing subterranean construction had shifted significantly over time. What might raise questions today could have been permissible or overlooked in earlier decades. This historical context tempered calls for immediate judgment. Media pressure intensified as the investigation remained quiet. Silence bred speculation. To counter this, officials released limited updates emphasizing process over discovery. They confirmed the tunnel's existence and basic characteristics without assigning motive. This transparency aimed to stabilize discourse without compromising integrity. Public fascination persisted nonetheless. The tunnel had become a symbol, representing the allure of hidden layers beneath familiar narratives. Commentators drew parallels to broader themes of privacy, legacy, and the unknowability of even well-documented lives. These reflections, while abstract, revealed why the story resonated so deeply. Within investigative circles, however, focus remained narrow. Teams cataloged findings, tested hypotheses, and ruled out extremes. No evidence suggested illicit activity, hidden crimes, or ongoing risk. That absence was as important as any discovery. It grounded the investigation in reality rather than conjecture. As days passed, the tunnel's significance shifted again. It was no longer about shock or fear, but about understanding how spaces outlive intentions. Structures persist after their purposes fade, leaving traces that invite interpretation. The tunnel was one such trace, a remnant of decisions made under circumstances now distant. Experts emphasize that many estates of similar age and location contained undocumented features, especially those shaped by multiple renovations. Time, not malice, often erased their stories. The difference here was visibility. Public attention transformed a technical finding into a cultural moment. Investigators prepared a comprehensive report synthesizing engineering data, historical records, and expert testimony. The report aimed to answer the central question with restraint. What can be known, and what must remain unknown? Not every structure yields a definitive story. Some resist closure. Above ground, life around the estate continued quietly. The property stood unchanged, its outward appearance unremarkable. Beneath it, the tunnel remained sealed, documented, and secured. Its mystery had not vanished, but it had been contextualized that, in the end, officials acknowledged that the tunnel did change things, but not in the way many expected. It changed understanding, not history. It reminded observers that certainty is rare, that interpretation must be earned, and that not every hidden space conceals a revelation. Sometimes, it simply reflects a choice made long ago, now resurfacing as a question rather than an answer. AS officials prepared to conclude the physical phase of the investigation. Attention gradually turned toward interpretation rather than excavation. Investigators understood that facts alone would not quiet speculation unless they were framed with clarity and restraint. They therefore focused on explaining what the tunnel was not, as much as what it was. It was not evidence of criminal activity, not a sign of ongoing danger, and not a hidden mechanism actively influencing events. Those distinctions were repeated carefully in briefings, emphasizing that absence of explanation did not imply presence of wrongdoing. The tunnel existed, it had a measurable structure, and it had a finite history, but its meaning was bounded by evidence. This approach frustrated some observers who expected dramatic revelations, yet it reflected the discipline required when dealing with incomplete information. Privately, investigators acknowledged that mystery itself had become part of the story, independent of any physical discovery. They noted how quickly uncertainty filled narrative gaps, especially when a familiar figure and a private space were involved. This observation prompted a broader discussion about perception, privacy, and the public's relationship with hidden details. Experts explained that tunnels, basements, and concealed rooms often acquire symbolic meaning far beyond their practical purpose. They represent what is unseen, and therefore invite projection, suspicion, or fascination depending on context. In this case, timing amplified that symbolism, as the discovery occurred amid heightened sensitivity and unresolved questions. Officials stressed that such amplification did not alter the underlying facts, but it did alter how those facts were received. The investigation team also considered the ethical dimension of disclosure, weighing transparency against the risk of misinterpretation. They opted for incremental release, believing that context mattered as much as content. Each update was crafted to answer specific questions while discouraging speculation that exceeded evidence. As attention gradually shifted away from the tunnel itself, some observers began reflecting on why the discovery had felt so disruptive. Analysts suggested it challenged assumptions about completeness, the belief that everything important is already known. The tunnel contradicted that belief, revealing how easily layers can remain hidden despite scrutiny. This realization resonated beyond the immediate case, touching on broader themes of history and memory. Historians noted that physical remnants often outlast their explanations, leaving future generations to infer intent. The tunnel fit this pattern, a durable structure separated from the circumstances that produced it. Investigators ultimately accepted that some questions would remain unanswered, not because of secrecy, but because of time. Time erodes records, blurs intent, and transforms practical choices into curiosities. In closing discussions, officials emphasized that responsible inquiry includes recognizing its limits. They cautioned against forcing conclusions where evidence does not support them. The tunnel had been documented, secured, and contextualized, fulfilling the investigation's mandate. What remained was interpretation, a space where imagination must yield to restraint. As public interest slowly waned, replaced by news stories and concerns, the tunnel settled into a quieter status. It became part of the estate's layered history rather than an active mystery. For investigators, that outcome signified success, a resolution grounded in proportion rather than spectacle. Yet the episode left a lasting imprint on how hidden spaces are perceived when they surface unexpectedly. It demonstrated that discovery alone can disrupt narratives, even absent dramatic content. Meaning arises not only from what is found, but from the questions discovery provokes. In that sense, the second tunnel achieved significance simply by existing. It exposed the fragile boundary between knowledge and assumption. Investigators hoped that this understanding would temper future reactions to similar discoveries. Hidden structures are not confessions, and concealment does not equal malice. They are artifacts of choices, shaped by context, fear, convenience, or foresight. Understanding them requires patience rather than urgency. As the report was finalized, one conclusion was stated plainly. The tunnel changed perceptions, not realities. It revealed complexity beneath a familiar surface, but did not rewrite history. In doing so, it served as a reminder of the limits of certainty. Not every discovery delivers answers, and not every mystery demands resolution. Sometimes, acknowledging what cannot be known is the most honest outcome. The second tunnel, once hidden and now documented, would remain as evidence of that principle. It existed quietly beneath the ground, no longer secret, yet never fully explained. And in that unresolved state, it reflected something enduring about human curiosity. People seek stories to anchor uncertainty, but reality often resists neat framing. The tunnel's story, restrained and incomplete, challenged that impulse. It asked observers to sit with ambiguity rather than rush to conclusion. For many, the discomfort lingered longer than any headline that in time. However, even discomfort fades, replaced by acceptance. The estate returned to its quiet routine, and the tunnel became a footnote. Yet for those who examined it closely, the experience reshaped how they approached hidden evidence. They carried forward a renewed commitment to caution, context, and humility. Those qualities investigators believed mattered more than any single discovery. As the file was closed and archived, it bore a final note. The findings were complete, but understanding would always remain partial. That acknowledgement marked the true end of the investigation. Everything else belonged to interpretation, memory, and time. In that sense, the tunnel did change everything, but quietly. It changed expectations, patience, and respect for the unknown. And when the dust finally settled, that change proved more lasting than mystery. The ground above remained unchanged, yet perspectives beneath it had shifted. Investigators walked away knowing that discovery is only the beginning of responsibility. How findings are framed, shared, and understood matters just as much as what is uncovered. This lesson, learned beneath an estate, extended far beyond its boundaries. In the end, the tunnel stood as a testament to careful inquiry. Not every answer is dramatic, but every answer must be responsible. That principle guided the investigation from start to finish. With that, the story transitioned from revelation to reflection, leaving behind understanding rather than fear and grounding curiosity in evidence, patience, and measured truth without haste or assumption. As the investigation formally moved into its closing phase, conversations among those involved took on a more reflective tone. Without the pressure of active discovery, there was space to examine how the situation had unfolded and why it had resonated so strongly beyond its technical significance. Many investigators acknowledged that the tunnel itself had become less important than the reaction it provoked. The structure was finite, measurable, and contained. The response to it, however, revealed broader patterns about how uncertainty is processed when it intersects with familiarity and public attention. One senior analyst remarked that the story gained momentum not because of what was found, but because of what people imagined might be found. In the absence of immediate clarity, imagination stepped in to complete the picture. This was not viewed as a failure of the public, but as a human reflex. When confronted with incomplete information, people seek coherence. They construct narratives to reduce discomfort. The tunnel provided a canvas onto which those narratives were projected. Investigators discussed how quickly language influenced perception. Terms like secret, hidden, and changes everything carried emotional weight far beyond their factual content. Each word implied intention, drama, and consequence, even before evidence supported such implications. This observation reinforced the importance of careful phrasing in official communication. Precision was not merely technical, it was ethical. There was also discussion about how private spaces take on public meaning once they enter collective awareness. An estate, previously known only through images and reputation, transformed into a symbol. The tunnel, invisible for years, became a focal point for questions about transparency, control, and legacy. None of these themes were inherent to the concrete and steel underground. They emerged from context. Some investigators reflected on similar cases from the past, where mundane findings were initially misinterpreted due to timing or association. Hidden rooms, sealed vaults, and forgotten structures often inspired fear or suspicion until documentation restored proportion. In those cases, as here, patience proved to be the corrective force. Facts accumulated slowly, but they eventually stabilized understanding. The team also considered the psychological dimension of subterranean spaces. Tunnels, by their nature, evoke imagery of escape, secrecy, or protection. They sit at the intersection of safety and concealment. Depending on perspective, they can represent prudence or paranoia. This duality made neutral interpretation challenging, especially in a climate already primed for intrigue. As part of the closing process, investigators compiled a comprehensive archive of the tunnel's documentation. Photographs, scans, material analyses, and expert opinions were organized not just for record keeping, but for potential future reference. They understood that questions might resurface years later, prompted by new information or renewed interest. Having a clear, factual record ensured that any future discussion could begin from evidence rather than speculation. Public interest continued to fade gradually, replaced by newer developments elsewhere. Headlines moved on, and the tunnel receded from immediate attention. Yet for those who had followed the story closely, a residue remained. The episode lingered as an example of how easily assumptions can form around incomplete data. It served as a reminder that not every mystery yields a revelation, and not every hidden structure conceals intent. Investigators expressed quiet satisfaction with how the case concluded. There had been no rush to judgment, no sensational escalation, and no compromise of standards. The process unfolded deliberately, guided by caution rather than urgency. In a media environment often driven by speed, this restraint was viewed as an achievement. Some reflected on how the investigation altered their own perspectives. They became more attuned to the narratives that surround physical findings, more aware of how context shapes meaning. This awareness extended beyond tunnels or estates. It applied to any situation where partial information meets public curiosity. The lesson was transferable as final briefings were delivered. Officials reiterated the central conclusion in simple terms. The tunnel existed. It had been constructed intentionally. It had been sealed deliberately. Its exact purpose could not be determined with certainty, but there was no evidence to suggest malicious use or ongoing relevance. This clarity, though unsatisfying to those seeking dramatic answers, represented the most honest outcome. The estate itself returned to relative anonymity. Without new developments, it became once again just a place, no longer a symbol. The ground beneath it remained unchanged, holding its structure silently. Over time, even the memory of the tunnel would likely soften, becoming a footnote rather than a focal point. Yet within investigative circles, the case continued to be referenced as an example of measured inquiry. It illustrated how discipline and humility are essential when confronting unknowns. Not every question can be answered, and not every answer carries narrative satisfaction. Accepting that reality is part of responsible investigation that in closing discussions. One investigator summarized the experience succinctly. The tunnel did not change history, but it changed awareness. It highlighted the distance between what is known and what is assumed. It reminded everyone involved that evidence must lead interpretation, not the other way around. This understanding marked the true conclusion of the case. The tunnel's physical presence was documented and secured, but its broader impact lay in the discipline it demanded. That discipline, once exercised, extended beyond the estate and into future work. It became part of professional memory. AS files were archived and teams disbanded. The final takeaway was clear. Discovery is not an endpoint. It is an invitation to responsibility. How information is handled after discovery determines whether it enlightens or misleads. In this case, restraint prevailed. The story ended not with revelation, but with reflection. And in that ending, there was a quiet integrity. The tunnel remained what it always had been, a structure beneath the ground. What changed was how carefully people learned to look at such structures and how slowly they learned to speak about them. That change, subtle and enduring, outlasted the headlines. It reshaped approach rather than belief. In the end, that was the most meaningful outcome of all. With the investigation officially closed, a final period of observation followed, one that did not involve excavation or analysis, but reflection on impact. Those who had worked closest to the case noted how quickly attention had shifted elsewhere, a reminder of how transient public focus can be. Yet they also understood that while headlines fade, lessons remain embedded in professional practice. The tunnel had become a reference point, a quiet example cited in discussions about restraint, communication, and a responsibility that comes with discovery. Internally, agencies reviewed how information had been released and how language had shaped reaction. There was consensus that the measured approach had prevented escalation. By resisting the urge to dramatize uncertainty, investigators avoided locking themselves into narratives that evidence could not support. This discipline was not easy. Pressure to provide certainty is constant, especially when curiosity peaks. Choosing patience over performance required coordination and trust. Some officials acknowledged that the story might have unfolded very differently under less controlled conditions. Had early speculation been indulged, the tunnel could have been framed as something it was not. Once such framing takes hold, it is difficult to undo. This realization reinforced the importance of early tone setting. How a discovery is first described often determines how it is remembered. Experts in communication noted that ambiguity is often mistaken for concealment. When authorities say, "We don't know," some interpret that as withholding. The tunnel case demonstrated that acknowledging uncertainty openly can build credibility rather than erode it, provided it is paired with visible effort and consistency. Transparency, they argued, is not about having all the answers, but about being honest about limits. The case also sparked broader professional dialogue about the ethics of curiosity. Not every hidden thing demands exposure. Not every question warrants pursuit beyond safety and legality. In this instance, investigation was necessary to ensure there was no risk or wrongdoing. Beyond that threshold, restraint became the ethical choice. This balance between inquiry and respect became a topic of ongoing discussion. Urban planners and historians weighed in later, offering perspective on how common such hidden structures actually are. Many properties, especially those shaped by decades of renovation, contain undocumented features. Time, not secrecy, is often the reason. Records are lost, ownership changes, and priorities shift. The tunnel fit comfortably within this pattern when viewed without sensational framing. As these perspectives circulated, public memory of the case softened. The initial shock gave way to a more nuanced understanding. People began to see the tunnel not as an anomaly, but as a reminder of how layered environments can be. Houses are not static. They evolve, accumulating traces of different eras. Some traces are visible, others remain buried. For those who followed the story closely, the ending felt anticlimactic, yet appropriate. There was no dramatic reveal, no singular object that redefined everything. Instead, there was context. Context, though less thrilling, proved more durable. It allowed the story to settle into proportion. Investigators noted that this outcome aligned with reality more often than fiction suggests. Most discoveries resolve not with revelation, but with clarification. The work lies in distinguishing between what is known, what can be inferred, and what must remain unknown. That discipline defines credibility. The tunnel, now sealed and documented, became part of the estate's archival record. Future owners, inspectors, or historians would encounter it not as a mystery, but as a documented feature with a known investigation behind it. In that sense, the tunnel story was complete, even if its original purpose was not. Looking back, many involved felt the case reaffirmed a core principle. Absence of explanation is not evidence of conspiracy. Sometimes is simply absence. Accepting that requires humility, both professionally and culturally. The impulse to fill gaps with narrative is strong, but resisting it preserves integrity. As time passed, the tunnel ceased to occupy mental space. New cases, new challenges, and new uncertainties emerged. Yet the approach refined here carried forward. Investigators applied the same caution elsewhere, aware that every discovery exists within a larger interpretive ecosystem, in quiet moments. Some reflected on how the tunnel had briefly disrupted assumptions about familiarity. A well-known place had revealed an unknown dimension. That revelation, though ultimately benign, reminded observers that certainty is often provisional. What we think we know is shaped by what we have seen, not by what exists. This understanding did not breed suspicion. It bred curiosity tempered by respect. Knowing that unseen layers can exist encourages humility rather than fear. It invites questions, but also patience that the final notes were filed. The case receded fully into record. There were no loose ends requiring pursuit, no unanswered safety concerns. The story had reached its natural conclusion. It ended not with drama, but with acceptance that in retrospect, that ending felt appropriate. The tunnel had never been a threat or a revelation. It had been a test of process, perception, and restraint. By meeting that test, investigators preserved trust and demonstrated that not every story must escalate to matter. The ground beneath the estate remained unchanged. The tunnel rested quietly, its existence acknowledged and contextualized. Above it, life continued, indifferent to the brief attention paid to what lay below. What endured was not the structure, but the lesson. Discovery carries responsibility. Interpretation demands humility. And sometimes, the most meaningful outcome is not an answer, but the discipline to stop asking when evidence no longer supports the question. As the weeks passed and the investigation faded from public view, the tunnel story entered a quieter phase, one defined not by action, but by integration. What had once felt disruptive slowly became absorbed into a broader understanding of how places accumulate history. Those who had been closest to the process noticed that the emotional intensity surrounding the discovery had softened into something closer to perspective. The tunnel was no longer a question mark demanding answers, but a resolved element within a much larger narrative about time, property, and interpretation. Within professional circles, the case continued to be referenced, not because of its drama, but because of its restraint. Training sessions and internal briefings cited it as an example of how measured communication can prevent distortion. Younger investigators were reminded that curiosity must always be guided by proportionality. Not every anomaly warrants escalation, and not every discovery benefits from urgency. The tunnel had taught that lesson clearly. Historians later contextualized the structure within a pattern common to properties developed or expanded during certain decades. Private tunnels, hidden rooms, and reinforced underground spaces were not unheard of, particularly in regions where privacy, security, or terrain made such construction practical. In that context, the estate's tunnel appeared less extraordinary and more representative of a particular mindset shaped by its era. This reframing helped shift lingering public perception. What initially felt unsettling began to feel understandable. The absence of a sensational conclusion allowed reason to replace speculation. Over time, the tunnel's presence became just another detail. Interesting but not alarming, noted rather than feared. For investigators, this transition marked success. The goal had never been to create closure through revelation, but through clarity. By establishing what could and could not be known, they had defined boundaries around interpretation. Those boundaries protected both truth and credibility. Some observers noted that the story's arc itself was instructive. It began with urgency, rose through speculation, and ended in moderation. That arc mirrored many public reactions to uncertainty. The tunnel's discovery had acted as a catalyst, revealing how quickly imagination fills gaps and how slowly it retreats once facts emerge. The estate itself continued to exist quietly, its routines uninterrupted. New owners, caretakers, or visitors would encounter the property without the weight of mystery that once surrounded it. The tunnel, sealed and documented, would not intrude on daily life. Its impact remained primarily conceptual rather than practical, that in retrospect, the phrase changes everything took on a subtler meaning. It did not change events, actions, or outcomes. It changed approach. It demonstrated how quickly assumptions can form and how carefully they must be managed. That change, though invisible, carried lasting value. Investigators reflected that the most important outcome was trust. By maintaining consistency and restraint, they preserved public confidence even amid uncertainty. That trust mattered more than satisfying curiosity. It ensured that future findings would be received with patience rather than suspicion. The case also reinforced the idea that not every hidden space conceals intention relevant to the present. Some structures are simply remnants of past decisions, made under circumstances no longer remembered. Their discovery invites questions, but not all questions have answers worth pursuing beyond safety and legality. As the tunnel settled into archival documentation, it became part of a closed chapter. The records were complete, the assessments thorough, and the conclusions sound. There was nothing left to uncover that would alter understanding. That completeness, though unspectacular, was the hallmark of responsible inquiry, in professional memory. The case endured as a reminder that the absence of drama does not equal absence of significance. Sometimes, the most meaningful investigations are those that end quietly, leaving behind process rather than spectacle. Looking back, some investigators acknowledge that the experience sharpened their sensitivity to narrative pressure. They became more aware of how quickly language can amplify uncertainty. This awareness influenced future communication strategies, fostering greater care in framing early discoveries. As time continued, the tunnel receded further into the background, its story complete. The estate's surface remained unchanged, and the ground beneath it held no new surprises. What remained was understanding, earned slowly and preserved carefully. The final takeaway, shared quietly among those involved, was simple. Discovery demands discipline. Curiosity must be balanced with humility. And not every mystery exists to be solved publicly. Some exist to remind us of the limits of knowledge and the value of restraint that in that sense, the tunnel fulfilled a purpose beyond its original design. It became a lesson in proportion, patience, and perspective. That lesson extended beyond one estate, one investigation, or one moment of attention. It shaped approach, tempered reaction, and reinforced trust. As the last reflections were filed, there was a sense of closure not defined by answers, but by acceptance. The tunnel had been acknowledged, understood as far as possible, and placed within context. Nothing more was required. And with that, the story truly ended, not with a revelation, but with equilibrium. The ground remained still, the structure beneath it unchanged, and understanding restored to scale. The investigation concluded not with certainty, but with clarity about what certainty could never fully provide. That clarity, grounded in evidence and restraint, was the final outcome. That be why the time the final addendum was released, there was little appetite left for speculation. What remained was a quieter appreciation for process, the kind that rarely draws attention but sustains credibility. The tunnel story had resolved into context, and context proved steadier than conjecture. Those who expected a twist found none, yet many recognized the value in that absence. The estate became ordinary again, not because anything had changed physically, but because understanding had caught up with curiosity. Sealed concrete and steel no longer suggested drama. They suggested maintenance, history, and closure. The documents filed would outlast headlines, serving as reference rather than rumor. Investigators closed their notebooks, knowing the outcome would not satisfy every imagination. That was never the aim. The aim was to replace uncertainty with proportion. In doing so, they demonstrated that restraint is an active choice, not a lack of effort. It requires confidence to stop digging. When evidence says stop, the public, too, adjusted. Attention drifted, conversations moved on, and the tunnel receded into memory. What lingered was a subtle recalibration of expectations. Not every discovery carries a secret, and not every hidden thing deserves a story beyond its facts. For professionals, the case became shorthand for a standard worth keeping. It reminded them to privilege accuracy over urgency, to let findings mature before conclusions harden, and to respect the boundary between what can be known and what should be left alone, that in retrospect. The most meaningful change was internal. Approaches refined, language softened, and patience strengthened. These shifts mattered more than any object found underground. They shaped future work in ways that would never be attributed to this case, yet were born from it. The tunnel remains, sealed and documented, an artifact without a narrative arc. Its presence neither threatens nor explains. It simply exists. That simplicity, earned through careful inquiry, is its final state. As the file rests in archive, the lesson persists. Discovery is a beginning, responsibility is the middle, and restraint is the end. When those three align, understanding follows. And when understanding follows, mystery no longer needs embellishment. It can rest, intact and uninflated, beneath the surface. That quiet resolution is often overlooked, yet it is the mark of work done well. There are no cliffhangers to exploit, no symbols to overread, no insinuations to sustain attention. Instead, there is closure shaped by evidence and bounded by humility. The tunnel's meaning was not amplified, it was contained. In a culture accustomed to escalation, containment itself becomes noteworthy. It demonstrates care for truth over traction and for people over spectacle. Such outcomes rarely trend, but they endure. Long after curiosity moves elsewhere, the standards applied here continue to guide decisions, informing how future discoveries are handled, explained, and ultimately understood. This continuity is the real legacy of the case, quieter than rumor, sturdier than hype, and far more valuable. It stands as a reminder that careful conclusions protect understanding when certainty is incomplete and curiosity demands speed above all else.